Okay, this is slide 2 on personality. It's insights from the 7 perspectives, and it'll be considerably shorter than the last one because much of it is a review. So we'll start with personality being defined again as patterns of thinking and behaving that are consistent across time and place. And again, personality theory addressing two major questions. What are the basic elements of personality, which we covered mostly in the last slideshow on trait theory and personality tests? And how does personality form and what are its structures? And that's what this one is about. So you're familiar now with the 7 perspectives because we've repeatedly alluded back to them during our different chapters that we've covered. And each of them is basically referred to as a personality theory. And this is the slide that specifically I went over in the last slideshow in more detail that speaks to it as specifically a personality theory. It also, each of these has therapies, so we will be visiting them yet again under upcoming unit. We only have social psychology and then disorders and therapies left, and the therapies are broken into these basic categories as well. So first of all, of course, we have biology, and there's lots of biological influences on our personality, and they can be quite strong. If you think about, for example, how a personality is influenced by something like menopause or puberty. Just to give a simple example, problems with brain structure or brain damage, influences from the environment on brain structures will influence how we behave, and therefore how it will have an effect on our what our personality is experienced as. How strong that effect is will vary, however, because there's obviously other influences on our personality. So the next one we're going to look at is behaviorism. This is a picture of Skinner and a quote by him, "Give me a child and I'll shape him into anything," which reflects the thinking at the time of behaviorists that basically it's all learned. And this has obviously changed. We now understand it's a 50-50 split, but believe it or not, 30 years ago the big argument was nature nurture, and they all thought they should get most of the piece of the pie. And now we know it's a give and take. So 50% of it is about a genetic determination, but once again, that's a range of determination. That's a range of possibilities, not a fixed set point. And you really don't know the outer limits of evolving yourself until you try it and give it a 100% go. And of course, we have the three main ways that we learn, including modeling, just watching others, which we can do throughout our lives by noticing and thinking about people that we respect and admire, that we would be more like, and as we reflect on them, we're sort of absorbing their characteristics into our being, and we can practice that. And then operant conditioning is reinforcement and punishment, including positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Remember, taking something away that reduces the likelihood that it will occur, punishment, or increases the likelihood, punishment reduces the likelihood, and so on. And classical conditioning is automatic. It creates reflexive actions that are learned, that are environmentally learned. And so we have our two pioneering behaviorists that you're already familiar with, including B.F. Skinner, who said that quote about "give me a child, and through reinforcement and punishment, I'll shape an amazing human being." And he had the best of intentions to create the highest moral people, people that were really, really good. So he had no malevolent intent. And then we have John Watson, whose motives are a little less benevolent, which means kind or goodwill, a little bit more malevolent, or at least more make himself famous. But he did show us and demonstrate unequivocally that paired associations are made automatically by the brain and then will repeat themselves back to us in a multitude of ways, including things like phobias, PTSD, and test anxiety, but also in positive ways when you make positive paired associations. Glance at your bathroom at a certain time of night and you automatically go brush your teeth. Just it's autopilot, and that's a positive paired association that elicits an autopilot behavior, and that's one of the ways that we can increase our conscientiousness is by positively inducing these habitual behaviors, these positive habits that we want to create so that we don't have to think about it. Because if we think about it, Oh, the id will win, won't it? And that's Freud, right? He's the one who brought up this idea of the unconscious, and even this idea, if you really think about it, it's the idea of subpersonalities of the id, ego, and superego, right? And he got this from studying hysteria and hypnotists, Charcot, and the ability to induce and remove, various different kinds of behavior, some of which are associated with hysteria, like jerking of a limb or something like that under the state of hypnosis. And therefore, Freud's conclusion, and there's others too, but Freud popularized it, so we've got to give him credit for that, that these things are within the psyche phenomena, intra-psychic phenomena, as compared to something coming from outside of us, like a spirit making us do it. So again, through hypnotherapy, we have the birth of psychoanalysis, which is using the talking cure and various ways of exhausting the ego. I mentioned that to you last time. The idea of Rorschach, ink blot cards, and so on, dream interpretation, these methods of sidestepping the ego defense mechanisms. Ego defense mechanisms are the way that we here's our defense mechanisms. This is just a couple of them, like denial, projection, displacement, and regression. Those are ones you're probably familiar with, at least denial, projection, and regression. Displacement is we take, say we get annoyed at work, but we can't take out our feelings there, so we go take it out at home. See, right here. So, but kick the dog, but yell at the dog or whatever is more likely what we're gonna do. All right, so we're back to hypnosis and psychoanalysis, and the idea that using these different kinds of means of getting to some of the influences on our personality characteristics and our behavior, like uncontrolled rebelliousness or something that might be fueled from a complex or intrapsychic problem, right? And Freud's idea of the iceberg theory. Red arrow, you should know the iceberg theory. Most of what's conscious, or most of what drives our behavior, is underneath the surface, is the short definition of the iceberg theory. Most of what drives our behavior is underneath the surface. So we think we're mostly controlling our behavior, but anytime that we find ourselves going for that fifth cookie, or promising we're going to go to bed early and get up early, and then staying up for the fifth episode of Black Mirror, we know that we have been taken over by some aspect of our subpersonality, probably a dimension of the id, right? And Freud defined these three different aspects of the subpersonality, identifying the internal structures of the psyche. Think of this like trying to identify the internal structures of the body. I mean, you can see them, but you can't really figure out what they do except through process of elimination and a lot of study. I mean, what does the liver do? We have tests now for that and stuff, but it took a long time to sort it out. And it's the same thing with the mind, and we're still doing that. We're new at it, really, with the mind. It's important that you know that the id is run by the pleasure principle, the superego by the ego ideal, or the idealized version of the self that's incorporated or internalized by almost an autopilot dimension of the psyche that works a lot like classical conditioning. You walk into a classroom, you see a chair, you automatically sit in that chair. You like that chair. Next time you come, you don't even think about it, but you gravitate to the exact same chair next time you come to that class. That's that autopilot of your brain, and it's also picking up information about what you need to do and how you need to behave in order to improve your rank and status in the social environment, because the social environment is so important to humans. And so it's constantly spitting that back to you. And it may or may not be accurate. In other words, it may or may not be good stuff. It may be unreasonable. It may be myopic. It may be not taking in the big picture. It probably has grains of truth in what it says, but it's not a holistic truth, because it's basically a funnel picking up data, including from things like all those magazines that you sort of glance at but don't really take in consciously. But this is the superego's taking it in and sort of scanning it and developing patterns and spitting those patterns back at you. So the ego has to analyze these patterns and assess them. You have to interface with your id and superego. You're not meant to be just a reactive pawn to their machinations, the tug and pull of the various ego and superego forces, right? And here we have kind of a little map. A lot of people say, what's preconscious or subconscious. And subconscious, we have things that move in and out of our conscious awareness, and or they're not fully in our conscious awareness, they're partially in our conscious awareness. We sort of get it, we sort of don't, because we're constantly transforming. So there's always going to be stuff like that. We're always learning and becoming more and more aware. So there'll always be stuff at the surface of what we're sorting out or that our mind is sorting out. But a really interesting idea that we have these different dimensions of our psyche, and that much of our psyche could be operating, but just like our bodily functions, much of our bodily functions operate without our thinking about it. Our digestion, our breathing, we can influence it and go in there and affect our digestion, affect our breathing by calming ourselves down or getting ourselves all amped up and anxious. But mostly they operate by themselves behind the scenes, and Freud's postulating that a bunch operates behind the scenes for us as well. Okay, this is the whole thing about the superego isn't necessarily correct. It usually has a grain of truth that you need to analyze and decide how much is accurate and how much you're going to, what makes sense. And that's the whole idea of rational therapy, is to use reason, incorporate reason in interfacing with these reason in our conscious self, and interfacing with these different subpersonalities that Freud was so good at identifying, that sort of are dynamics that live within us. These are Freud's defense mechanisms. These are ways that we keep forbidden and or anxiety producing realizations, because denial, right? Things we don't want to deal with, or overwhelming, or too much. Like, for example, all of us, we can't handle the actual amount of suffering that goes on all over the world. So we're in moderate state of denial about it, right? That's fairly obvious to everybody. And we have to be in order to be psychologically functioning. So it's not that these defense mechanisms are necessarily bad or that they shouldn't be there. Their function is protective. They can get over functional, and we can have too much regression, which is going back to a lower level of functioning when we're under stress is regression. And we can do that as adults, right? So we just become less mature and less evolved whenever we're under a great deal of stress, and so being aware of that, we can be supportive of ourselves through that process. And projection, anytime you feel a charge over something, over somebody doing something, that there's a little bit of projection going on there. And projection can happen because you got some stored up energy about something because you experienced a radical response to it sometime in your life. For example, you had a really hard childhood, so you think other people should have really hard childhoods, and you project, you're critical of people who aren't tough in their childhood. Or it could be reverse projection too. It could be you are a really angry person, but you don't like that, you repress it, and so you see angry people as really, really bad. And so when we feel a hyper reaction to something, and we think, oh, that reaction might be out of proportion to what's going on, then that is an example of that. That is a reasonable hypothesis that there's a little projection at some point going on there. It's an area of inflammation, is a way to think about projection. And sometimes we can be in denial. If we're in denial about a projection, then that's where it can cause us thorny trouble. And then we talked about, during the developmental phase, Freud's psychosexual stages of development, his seeing sexuality as a major theme in influencing, like a primary task or a primary influence on our behaviors and motivations, and the idea of the Oedipal complex and so on. But we're going to move into the new now. Well, a little bit new. Carl Jung, we'll look at some slides of him. You're familiar with him. Alfred Adler is a Neo-Freudian, another Neo-Freudian. These were all three Neo-Freudians, and Karen Horney, who had slightly different views of things. So let's take a quick look. You already know about Jung. He's on the bridge between psychodynamic theory. He was Freud's favorite, as you know, for a long time. But then many people also reference him in the humanist category because of his transformational view of the psyche. And you have the higher self down here, and then the self with the smaller s, the little me, as Eckhart Tolle refers to it, is the one up here. So we have to go into still small spaces, that quiet centering, to go to the center, to find that center of the self. And the last time I showed you a physical representation of that as the mandala, which Jung saw as something that humanity drew. And, those coloring things are very popular right now. He would want to see you do them freeform, start with the coloring ones, and then evolve to doing them freeform, your own mandalas like he did. As reflect, you start in the middle or you can start in the outside and move toward the middle. And labyrinths are the same thing, like the Grace Cathedral. They're labyrinths that take you toward the center. So Jung had the idea of the unconscious and archetypes, and it's a wonderful set of ideas for you to explore. Everybody's encouraged to pick one theorist to go into in more depth during your assignment or discussion during this unit, and to use as a reference from their point of view. Just read about it in the text a little bit, a few paragraphs, or Google some information on it, and from a reliable source. And Jung's view of the archetypes, we talked about personality theory. You could look at his 16 archetypes, and I will post some personality tests like Jung's MBTI personality test for you to take. Alfred Adler is the neo-Freudian that came up with birth order psychology. Recent really good article about this in Time magazine just a couple of years ago. So a real update since Adler's time, and saw anxiety as a major influence in personality development, in particular social anxiety. And another theorist, another neo-Freudian that's talked about in the book, Karen Horney, also focused on relationships and social connection. She saw social connection, not sexuality, as the primary human motive, and she's probably right there. Although, from the biological drive of evolutionary theory of survival, it's going to be procreating the species. But social connection is the first thing needed to do that. So, because cooperation is our primary function. So, probably, I mean, the people would argue, the scientists today would argue between these two, even still. It's just impossible to really distinguish. But probably social influences in our more complex brain are more pivotal to our development, but maybe not entirely. I find myself just flipping back and forth. And she was an early feminist who say, wait a minute, penis envy is, we can't take that literally. If anything, it's a reflection of women wanting, rightfully so, the freedoms that men had then that they did not during the Victorian era, which we basically have gained the freedoms, all the freedoms that, or almost all the freedoms, especially with reproductive freedom that Karen Horney would want us to have. And then the neo-Freudian Erik Erikson, you remember him. We looked at him at developmental psychology. He was the one who looked at how people change throughout life and came up with terms like midlife crisis, right? So Freud's developmental model was stopped here over, basically, Freud said, give me a boy till the age of 5 and I will give you the man. And Erikson is arguing that we change throughout life, right? And so he came up with the ideas like identity crisis in young adulthood and midlife crisis in later adulthood, because he's matching out the developmental stages over that time. And once again, on a social model, right, rather than a sexual model. So you remember that Freud up here is saying the oral stage for Erik Erikson, the oral stage is trust versus mistrust, right? And the anal stage is autonomy versus self-doubt. So this is trust. That's a social emotional function as compared to, are my physical oral needs being met? But boy, it's hard to argue between biology and social, which one's first, because it's almost like social's in there with biology as a primary need. That's what we learned from Harlow's monkeys, right? It's right in there as a primary need, like food and water. So it's right there. All right, so now we're going to go to the humanists. And you remember, humanists shifted the focus of their emphasis. They're not discounting what Freud has to say in the psychoanalyst, but they're adding to it. And they're saying, what you guys are not accepting here is that humans can consciously choose to change and transform their personality. And of course, we have evidence for that now with the neuroscience. Humanist Abraham Maslow looked at the qualities of self-actualized people, which is a great little research segue to look at what are the qualities. I think there were 23 or something like that he identified that self-actualized people have. It's a wonderful list to look at and see where you see that you think you are and which ones you want to cultivate, because once again, these are cultivatable qualities. We can all move because we all have a tendency, like the humanists argue that just like plants, which will do the best they can to be the best plant it can in the environment it's given. Humans also are more or less structured that way as well. Of course, with trait psychology, we realize that like plants, we're all given some different genetics to do that with, but nonetheless. So the idea is that people move in a positive direction, and the humanists are saying that we have some conscious power to shape or influence how much we move in that positive direction. Carl Rogers, again, focused on relationships, and our sense of inner congruence of our personality is a big term for Carl Rogers, meaning that if we have an id, ego, super ego that are vastly far apart, if our behavior does not match our sense of how we think we should behave, and there is a very wide gap between those two, then we will not be in congruence. So coming to states of self-acceptance is required for us to be in congruence. And when we're out of congruence, it's a high anxiety state because we're never comfortable with ourselves. So establishing a sense of congruence, a fair congruence. And he felt that these qualities were required in relationships, both personal and therapeutic relationships. I liked what Karen said up here. Not where is she? Karen Horney set up here. Fortunately, analysis is not the only way to resolve inner conflicts. Life itself still remains a very effective therapist, and that's absolutely true. And some people are more therapeutic for us than others, and of course, it's therapeutic to be challenged just as it's therapeutic to be accepted. But one of the things that Rogers noticed was that people don't change in environments in which they feel critically judged, and so to help them, they need to feel first deeply accepted on a profound level, and these are the three qualities that engender that sense of acceptance. And then there is a therapeutic or healing natural response, Rogers argued, as a result of that. And it turns out he's right. Research shows that Rogers is right. Now we look at the cognitive perspective, and of course this is relating to how we think influences how we feel, and we've looked at mindsets and various manifestations of this. Kelly McGonigal's work on even our interpretation of the fight or flight response in our body, seeing that as our body galvanizing its energy to meet a challenge, actually influences the relaxation of our blood vessels. Absolutely amazing. We're just at the brink of understanding how the cognitive perspective influences things and influences our personality and how it manifests itself. We do know one thing that I can say very clearly, that one of the things we talked about in the cognitive perspective was, this idea of pessimistic and optimistic mindsets. And there's value to pessimistic thinking because you want to think through worst case scenarios also because they could happen. And so it's best to be prepared, right? But you don't want to dwell on them, because if you dwell on worst case scenarios, then you develop a negative mindset, and a negative mindset creates a negative biochemistry and nervous system, amplifies the fight or flight response and the sympathetic nervous system response, which will mess with your digestion and so on. So got to learn how to manage that negative cognition and negative rumination, which is thinking about the negative stuff on and over and over, is a direct symptom of depression. And not only that, but it's a cause of depression. In other words, it'll over time build up and lead to depression and anxiety states. So learning how to manage this cognition is a big goal. Once again, because of the negativity bias, and especially if you have, say, a sensitive system, you come in with a sensitive emotional system, you come in maybe feeling a lot of negative affect or negative emotion, you're in a difficult environment, and then you're an adult. Now you've got this pattern of habit of these years of living, and it's small still. So you can shift it out and change it still quite radically. And so this is a good time to be working on that, because there can be major changes in how our cognition works. I'll post a video on this in the extra credit module. All right, so then we start getting people in the 1966 and the 1960s who start making connections between these, because people start to realize by then, of course, all these perspectives make sense. Oh, I skipped one, sorry. Sociocultural perspective, looking at how society and culture influence thought and perspective. We actually have a whole chapter of this coming up next, which is social psychology, where we're really going to be looking at some of the big themes in the sociocultural perspective. just a small handful of them, but very big themes. So we got a whole chapter on that coming next. And then we have people who start making connections between the perspectives, like Julian Rotter would often refer to as the social cognitive perspective and his idea of internal and external locus of control, and how that influences how people behave. People have a very internal locus of control, feel like they control the consequences of their behavior, feel more powerful out in the world, and so naturally have better outcomes. And people who develop an external locus of control, that's the assumption that everything, it doesn't matter what I do, things are going to just come out the way they are because the control is outside me, it's not inside me. We have looked at this, and some people have referred to this as a victimized mindset. It's not being victimized. Being victimized is when you have a traumatic experience, and then it's a natural repercussion of being victimized to experience a victimized mindset for a little while. But you don't want to cement into learned helplessness. That's the whole thing. And that's why the idea of get back on the horse, right? To avoid it locking in to this mode where you don't feel like you have the power. This is I have the power, this is I don't have the power. And there's enormous literature that external locus of control and seeing the powers outside oneself is strongly correlated with depression and lower correlates of doing well. And then, of course, we have the evolutionary perspective. And the emphasis of the evolutionary perspective with its three themes on survival, characteristics that all humans share. So they're going to look at traits, and the big five is something that traits that are cross-cultural. And then we have, and all humans share, and then the big picture timeline of human history, which gives us more insights about personality theory, like insights on ADHD and the idea of diverse brain wiring patterns rather than disorder, shifting out of that kind of thinking. Here's our little model, our short model of the 7 perspectives with another take on, each one of their priorities. And then we have some practice quizzes at the end, which would be smart for you to run through again, because once again, the final is comprehensive, and of course, a great deal of it's anchored on the 7 perspectives. So it's an excellent time for us to review it. It's also a good time for us to get re-anchored in them, because we're going to be looking at therapies, right? And each one of these persons has a therapeutic tradition. Julian Rotter has a therapeutic tradition. Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow. Okay, so it's really helpful to look at the 7 perspectives and get warmed up for the therapies section as well. So, focus as you're doing this on reminding yourself of all of the key ideas, and also absorbing some of these new theorists that you're being introduced to, reminding yourself. And I'll be looking in your discussions and assignments, especially for a little extra research on this, going beyond this slide, for example, on at least one theorist, and looking at either your text or doing some Google research and getting a better idea. And pick anyone that you're just most naturally drawn to and use that in your assignment and discussion analysis, where you're drawing on a personality theory. Stretch beyond Freud's id, ego, and superego, okay? Then it makes it really fun, and we all learn a lot, because it's helpful to have all of these frameworks. And of course, in a personality, those of you who are going to major in social and psychology, you'll have an entire class on personality theory, where the whole thing will be to go into depth on these and numerous other theorists as well, but certainly these guys. All right, thanks everybody, and I will see you